6048 November, declaring an emergency. We're going to talk about both times I've had to use that phrase. We're going to talk about the circumstances behind it, and we're going to talk about what the aftermath was after I declared an emergency. So let's get into this. Welcome to the hangar, fellow aviators. My name's Matt Farrell and I'm the flying salesman. We're still down for maintenance. 210's not up and flying yet, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you guys a little bit about declaring emergencies. The first time I declared an emergency in 6048 November, it was for a landing gear issue. I took off out of Shreveport and the landing gear did not retract fully. One side would come up, but the other side was just kind of dangling and didn't want to get into position like it should. We'd been troubleshooting this issue, and every time I would put the landing gear back down in the extended position, it would come back down and lock with no problem. It was just a retract issue. My fear all along was eventually this would turn into an extension issue as well, and that's what happened on this flight. So I went to the north practice area and I did everything that you're taught to do to try and get the landing gear to come down. I tried yaw maneuvers, I tried dive maneuvers, I tried climb maneuvers, stalled the airplane, everything that I could do to try to get that try to get that landing gear in the down and locked position. I could get it into position if I left the gear pump running, but it wouldn't stay in position. The gear pump will pop the circuit breaker if you allow it to run too long. So I would pull the circuit breaker, and when I'd pull the circuit breaker, that left main gear would come down and I could see it dangling out there and just to outside my cabin window. Eventually, after trying all the maneuvers and flying around in circles for well over an hour, I decided to come in to Shreveport Regional Airport. That's where I had a mechanic that was going to be able to observe the flybys and wanted him to look at the landing gear. Of course, the control tower, they had binoculars, they looked at the landing gear as well. And I did a flyby down one of the runways and they told me that the landing gear was down and locked. However, I had my cell phone with me. My mechanic said that that left main gear did not look like it was in position. He was a 210 pilot himself, so I felt confident that he knew where things were supposed to be and what it was supposed to look like. Flew around the Shreveport Regional Airport for a few circles, talking to the mechanic on the cell phone, trying to work out what we were going to do. And it was decided that let's try and do a pass with the gear pump running and me pumping the gear at the same time. The first pass was the gear running, the gear motor running, and without me pumping the gear down, and it was not in the correct position. When I flew over the next time while hand pumping the gear down and the motor running, my mechanic said, yes, it looks like it's in position. The 210 landing gear is such that when there's weight on the wheels, the landing gear cannot collapse. The folding action of that landing gear is such that when it's in the saddles, it cannot collapse. When you jack that airplane, you actually have to have the airplane about 4 foot, 5 foot off the ground for the landing gear to be able to swing and clear the ground when you're doing a gear swing during the annual. So I did that, I flew over, the gear seemed to be in position, and at that point in time, it was time to come in and land. I actually did not declare the emergency until I was committed to coming in to land. I felt like I had a good running engine, had a good flying airplane, and I was just sorting out an anomaly at that point. I was not in congested airspace, and so I had not declared an emergency. But when it became officially time for me to come in and land, I said those words, 6048 November, declaring an emergency. They asked me if I wanted to have the trucks on standby, and I said that's affirmative, just not knowing really about the nose gear, what was going to happen with the nose gear. Set up for my downwind, came base to final. Coming down final, I knew I needed to hand pump the gear with the gear pump running and land the airplane. I knew once I got weight on the wheels that the landing gear would stay in position. There's no way it could collapse. And then it was just a function of what was the nose going to do, where the nose lock actually in place and going to hold the nose up. Did a fantastic landing, set it right down on the mains nice and gentle, lowered that nose. I actually wound up pulling the mixture to idle because I wanted to reduce my forward momentum. The engine was close to TBO at the time, so the mechanic and I talked about it and said there was no reason to kill the engine on final or anything like that. It's better to land with power, fully under control, and not do a dead stick landing. But once I had weight on the wheels and the nose was in the air, I went ahead and pulled that engine anyway, just to reduce my forward momentum as much as possible and be able to set that nose down as gently as possible. And everything worked out. I mean, you know, here's a picture of me on the runway, smiling after center line, right there where I was supposed to be, nice smooth landing. So I was really happy about that. The funny thing was, I got out of the airplane and was waiting for a tug. I wanted my mechanic to verify the gear was down and locked, and I wanted a tug to tow me off the airplane because I didn't want to move the airplane for fear of causing any problems. The fire truck was sitting just off the runway on a taxiway, and I had to get back in the airplane, turn the radio on, and say, hey, is anybody coming? Because I had stood outside the airplane for a few minutes and nobody was showing up. The tower told me, he said, well, the fire truck will be there in just a second. And remember, this is COVID, so this is right in the middle of March 2020. And the fire truck pulls up, and I remember the guy getting out of the fire truck. He was dressed much like I'm dressed now. He had a polo shirt on and khaki pants, and he said, here, I need you to sign this form. And I thought it was so funny that, you know, I was wanting to see him get out in, you know, the silver suit and ready to run in and drag me out of a burning airplane, but that just wasn't what he was going to do. I guess maybe he would have come up and squirted water on my airplane if he was if I was on fire. So to this day, that sticks in my mind as something that's kind of humorous about that event. The second time I declared an emergency, I was down in Florida. Took off out of Fort Myers, Florida, headed to Fort Lauderdale Executive. There was weather in the area. We had some rain coming through, and the airplane had sat on a ramp overnight and had gotten rained on, which is not unusual. I travel quite a bit. I'm not always able to put the airplane in a hangar, and it gets rained on from time to time. Taxied out, everything was normal. I knew that I was going to enter the clouds at about 3,000 feet and be IMC most of the way across the Florida Peninsula, and I was expecting to be VFR once I got to Fort Lauderdale Executive. I was going to have to navigate my way around the heavier rain showers that were in the area, and I knew I was going to divert south and had put that on request upon my departure. So I blast off out of Fort Myers. They give me that southerly turn like I requested, and everything's looking good. And my primary flight display X's out. Just complete AHRS failure. And I had not gone IMC yet, thank goodness, because one of the most disorienting things about that is I immediately lost my heading. And I thought, well, that's okay. I have my track on the Garmin GTN 750. And to this day, I haven't figured out what caused this, and neither the Garmin guys or the Aspen reps that I've talked to at shows and such have been able to explain to me what happened. But the airplane on the GTN 750 started spinning in a circle like a pinwheel. It just started spinning, and I had no track and I had no desired track. So the next instinct was to get on my magnetic compass and be able to maintain my heading via magnetic compass because I was given a heading. I called ATC and told them that my primary flight display had failed and I needed vectors back to the airport. And I was on a magnetic compass. And that was the interesting thing, is I did not declare an emergency, but they said, well, we're going to declare it. Their words were, when they responded, they said, Roger, 48 November, turn to a heading of 360, we're declaring an emergency for you. And that was something new to me, that I'd never heard of ATC declaring that emergency for you. Obviously, it was a situation where I needed assistance from ATC, certainly would have needed additional assistance had I been IMC. Now I'm doing a partial panel approach into the airport and would need their assistance to set all that up. I was able to do the 180-degree turn. I stayed VMC and landed without incident. But my mind always goes back to, I don't know if you've followed long enough to see my videos, my personal takeoff minimums are 1,000 feet. And one of the reasons why that is for that instance. Having been in that instance, having to shoot an approach partial panel to minimums sounds like zero fun to me. So I don't want to experience that, and so I negate some of that risk by keeping my ceilings above 1,000 feet, if at all possible. You'll see me from time to time take off 800 feet, something like that. But it's really dependent upon the total picture of the weather and what I feel like is going on and how easy it is going to be to get back in. You'll see me do that often leaving Shreveport downtown, an airport that I'm very familiar with, surrounding area I'm very familiar with, and approaches that I'm very familiar with. So was able to get back on the ground and was able to work with an avionics shop, and we discovered that water had penetrated down the RSM of the Aspen and gotten into the connector and had gotten water into the connector, and that's what caused my failure. In both instances of declaring an emergency, I didn't know what was going to happen in the aftermath, but it was really refreshing and really nice to find out that the FAA inspectors and investigators that I worked with, their main concern, first of all, was what happened in the airplane. Did everything, obviously it worked out because there wasn't an incident or an accident, but they really did express a concern for the event and my well-being and what happened. And then it was just questions to determine what was the failure that resulted in the emergency and what did we do to alleviate that failure or fix that squawk so that it didn't happen again. And they even went further to investigate or ask, is this a problem that's indicative of the airframe or the avionics or something that would cause them to look into those systems that would require a deeper look. And this was, you know, I'd hate to use the word routine, but there was nothing exotic about these failures that would cause them to think that there was a lingering issue with the fleet. This was just specific to our airplane. Both instances, we got the airplane to a mechanic or to a qualified avionics shop. We got the squawk remedied, and all I had to do was provide them a copy of the return to service in both instances, and it was case closed. There was the initial phone call that they reached out to me and told me we wanted to have this discussion, kind of went through the details, went through the particulars of what happened, and at the end of the call, they said, please email me a copy of the return to service, and that'll be the end of it. And I emailed that to them and asked them to acknowledge the receipt. They acknowledged the receipt and told me that they were closing the investigation into my emergency. There were no check rides, there was no people with flashing lights and all that fun stuff coming to check me out and see what was going on. It was really after the events, it really was a nothing burger. There was nothing to it. And I want to encourage you that if you run into a problem and you need help and you need to declare an emergency, don't be afraid to do it. And in both instances, there was a moment where I recognized I was having a serious problem. But thankfully for me, and I feel like that this is a blessing, if I'm going to have an emergency, I'd much rather have it when I'm by myself. And I do fly the airplane by myself most of the time. There are times I have passengers on occasion, and if I'm going to have an emergency, I would much rather have that emergency when I'm by myself. But that's that feeling that you have come over you that, oh crap, things are not going right. But I had to tell myself, Matt, you're the only one in the airplane and you're the only one that can fix it. And that's what I'm going to encourage you guys to do. You're the only one in the airplane, or you're the pilot in command, you're the one that's going to have to fix it. You're going to have to get out your checklist. You're going to have to revert back to your training. Think about all these little nuggets of wisdom that your flight instructors have told you and work the problem. Work the problem to find a solution to land that airplane as safely as possible. I do want to say that if you're ever involved in this, and it's something that I've done over the years, and I think it's really important, is I sat down and I wrote down the details of the events the next day. It's fresh on your mind. You have an opportunity to kind of go through everything while you still remember it with clarity, and it was nice to be able to reference those notes when talking to the FAA. The other thing it does is it allows you to analyze what you did in those moments and what you should have done differently. For me, with the issue with the landing gear, the thing that I really kicked myself for, I ran the checklist for a failure to extend landing gear, and the one thing I did not do is I did not open the cabin doors because I was still flying around the airport and I didn't want those doors open. And I said, well, I'll do that when I come in to land. Well, in the process of declaring my emergency and my mind being on pumping the gear down, I didn't do that. And that's something that I kick myself for, because especially in that event, especially if that fireman didn't have his fire suit on, maybe it didn't matter. He wasn't going to try and get me. But I didn't pop those doors. And that's something you always want to do anytime you make an off-airport landing, or you make a landing where you think maybe the airplane is not going to stay on its wheels or something like that. In the event of the primary flight display failure, the thing that I really disappointed in myself is, you've seen it in my videos, many of you have asked about it, is I have the Garmin backup GPS there on my yoke, and I did not look down at it for my heading, and that would have been a lot better off for me to use that if it worked. Like I said, it is on crossfill, so AirInc 429 has it talking to my Garmin GTN 750, so maybe it was corrupt as well. I'm not sure, but that was a resource that I didn't take advantage of, and that's something that I do in my training, and you guys are going to see more of that coming up in future videos, me doing partial panel exercises and using that Garmin on the yoke for what its intent is, which is a backup and a last ditch effort. The other thing I have available to me is the iPad. It has an AHRS built into the Stratus that's up on the glare shield, and that's a tool that I need to be able to take advantage of and use as well. I was so disoriented, not because of the clouds, not for being in the weather, but I was disoriented because of the failure of the GPS. It was that not being able to confirm what was going on. And instead of abandoning the tool I was trying to use, I should have just transitioned to those instruments that I knew that I could depend on, and I didn't do that. So take that opportunity, document and reflect on what happened so that you can become a better pilot. As always, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you coming along on the flights. I am enjoying the community that we're building together. You guys have given me a lot of great input about the hangar, about the videos. I'm really looking forward to putting your comments and ideas in the videos that I've got coming up. So I really appreciate the engagement. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We're doing fantastic. We're growing the channel, and you guys are a great part of that, and I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you on the next one.